All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I am Valerie Lockhart with Code Savvy, and this is the second video in our software development virtual series. And I am joined today by Candace from AWS, who is going to be talking to us about the different roles on a development team and also what Agile methodology is. So I will turn it over to Candace and we'll get started.
Right. Thanks, Valerie.
Thank you.
And hi, everyone. As Val said, I am Candace Bohannon, and I currently work at AWS as a solutions architect. But prior to working here, I worked at a couple of other companies where I did like technical leadership. I did a lot of different roles in software development, including the role of a product owner. So I'm really passionate about Agile methodology and Scrum frameworks and things like that. And so I was really excited to be able to give this presentation today. So you see my starter slide right here, and I'm fibbing like this much. I'm actually no longer a certified product owner. Those certifications expire after some amount of time, but I was trained to be a certified product owner by one of the inventors of Scrum, actually named Jeff Sutherland. So again, super passionate about it, and I think it's a really good way of developing software in general. So as we jump into all of that, and before we even talk about agile development, I think it's important to kind of talk through the activities, just at a high level, the activities in software development. So typically what happens, and I don't even have a bullet point for it actually, is someone has an idea. Like they're like, oh, we can do this thing with software or some kind of technical solution. We can do a thing. And then once you kind of realize that there is an idea here, then you're going to start to think through all of your requirements and gather up that documentation and things like that. So that's kind of this plan and design phase. You want to figure out what do you need to achieve this idea, and how are you going to like piece all of those things together. So that's plan and design, or requirements gathering. And then the part that most people think about, and it does take probably half of the amount of time, is writing the code that actually implements those requirements. So that's where we actually have our software engineers and software developers writing the code to do the thing that we defined in our requirements. So you can start to see how these build on each other, and the requirements. First of all, the idea is really important, of course. And then writing the requirements accurately is super important, so that then the developers can write the code to suit those requirements. As you go through and you have a little bit of code that is working, you typically would have another team or people on the team who are going to do that quality assurance and test the code to make sure that it's actually doing what the requirements say. So adding another layer of importance to those requirements, now we have another set of eyes looking at the software that was developed based on the requirements that were written. So the QA or tester looks at the requirements and does what they think the software should do, and make sure that the software works as the requirements are written and the idea was kind of intended to be. So all of these things are kind of coming together now, and we've gone through 4 of our nodes here in this cycle. Once the QA team and say that the requirements have been satisfied, and you have something that's good enough to send out and let people actually use, then you're going to deploy that software. So that means we just kind of push it out and let people start to use it. So we want to deploy that code to our end users. So maybe I'm sure some of you have a cell phone, and you will get a new operating system sent out to you every so often, and you have to update that code. So when your iPhone tells you new operating system available, they are deploying that new operating system code out to you, and then you can install it, download and install it on your phone. So that's kind of what we're talking about with this deploy node in our graph. And then finally, we start to get feedback from the users. So ideas don't come from just nowhere. These ideas came from an opportunity to make something better. So whether these ideas are adding a new feature to an existing application or operating system or whatever that already exists, or if it's brand new, like when people came up with rideshare things like Uber and Lyft, that was a brand new idea that was then pushed out, and they went through all of this cycle. And eventually we find bugs. We find things that aren't really working the way that we, the end users, kind of expected those to. So that could be a bug, which then would get fed back into a plan to design, develop, test, and deploy an improvement upon. Sometimes you'll just say, oh, I really wish that I knew, like, let's talk about like rideshare things. Like a feature that wasn't there at the very beginning was knowing where exactly your driver was. So maybe you had like a timer when he was going to arrive, but you didn't know exactly where he was. And so someone said, wouldn't it be great if we had a map feature added in my rideshare application? So now this is a new feature that gets added in that we're going to plan, design, develop, test, and deploy back out to our new version of the software. So that's kind of the cycle, the infinity cycle that we're just going to continue to go through. So an important thing that took me something to realize is that software is never done. It's a continuous cycle. We're going to continue to make it better, whether that's with new features or just improving what you've pushed out, changing colors of buttons, whatever that might be. Your software is really never done. So to achieve all of these things, like as we're going through this cycle of software development again and again, there are various different roles in software development. So typically, the business analyst is the person who is writing the requirements. So the business analyst goes out, listens to the person who came up with the idea or the customers, end users, and says, oh, I am hearing you say that you would like to have a map feature in the rideshare app. And so now the business analyst is going to write that up, what he or she thinks that that should be. So that then the software engineers can implement that, and again through our cycle. We probably all know about the software developer. That's the person that's actually writing the code. You could be a specialized software developer. Maybe you like to design the user interface, the parts with the buttons that people actually click. Or maybe you like to design the way the data is stored in the back, like from the database administrator. Or maybe you like the middle of it. That's typically called an API, application programming interface. And that's where the front end, the user interface, talks to the back end. So there's a lot of different types of software developers, even though I only have it listed as one bullet point here. There's even more than the few that I just mentioned as well. I briefly mentioned a database administrator. They're sometimes called a DBA. And they are really good at writing SQL commands, and they can think of like the hugest Excel spreadsheet you've ever seen. That's essentially a database, and they're masters at figuring out how to get that data out and turn it into information that then the applications can use. So it's another really important job. I also briefly mentioned QAs or testers on the previous slide. So the quality assurance engineers, they're the ones that are going to write out the test cases. They look at the requirements that the business analyst wrote and decide how are we going to use the software to test the requirements to make sure that it works properly. Sometimes there's also a release engineer or a DevOps engineer. They're the ones that are actually pushing that code out. They're deploying the code so that their end users can actually use that code. So a release engineer, site reliability engineer, DevOps engineer, those kind of are similar roles in this part of the software development lifecycle. And then one that I think is sometimes overlooked is this project manager. And the project manager makes sure that all of the people are working together to deliver this software in the right amount of time. So that project manager is also a really important role. And they also oftentimes will liaise, like work between the business units, the customers, and the software development team. So there's a lot of people. It's not just a person sitting at their computer writing up all of this code. There's a lot of people that typically go into creating one little piece of software for you. So now with that bit of background on how do we get software out, like what are the roles and how does this happen and what is the cycle? I want to start talking a little bit more about agile software development. So this is a slightly different approach. So to like in the past, the 80s, the 90s, even 20 years ago, it was clear cut who did what. I went through all of those roles before. So the business analyst writes the requirements, the software engineer writes the code, the QA tests it, and everyone has their role. Well, with agile methodology, it's just a little bit different. We are talking about project management and how are we going to organize and deliver this project. But what we want to do is we want to create our teams that are cross-functional. So we want to have all of those roles that I mentioned on the previous slide. We want to have all of those on a single team. Prior to agile development, there were oftentimes split based on your role. So you would have a QA team and a software engineering team. And so agile development says, let's bring all of those people together. And sometimes you might be writing requirements and writing the code. Maybe I'm testing your code and I just wrote a new requirement. So we all kind of wear the different hats and we try to be much more cross-functional. So that's a key piece of agile software development. Also, instead of looking at the whole idea, the whole big project in one big bang, agile software development, we try to break it up into smaller pieces of incremental progress. So we'll talk a little bit more about it in a couple of slides, but we want to be able to deliver working software each little cycle. So instead of taking 6 months or 6 years to deliver something, let's get something out to our users within about 6 weeks, push that out really quickly and get the feedback back from our users and piece that back into our requirements so that we're continuing to improve our software much more quickly. So it kind of speeds up the whole cycle of software development. So instead of having one big circle, now we have a whole bunch of little circles all together. So if you go out and read the Agile Manifesto, which I think was written in like 2000 or late 90s, something like that, there are really 4 main values of Agile methodology. And these are written out here. And it's not one of the key things that they kind of like to underline is that they're not saying those things on the right are not important. It's just saying that we value the things on the left more so. So we want to make sure that our individuals are happy and contributing code that they can kind of feel good about and seeing that progress again and again. So the individuals and interactions, the team is a really important piece of agile methodology. And that's more important than sticking to specific processes and tools. I think this is kind of interesting too, because I'm talking about agile like it has these strong rules associated with it, and it really doesn't. It's a framework that you can use to break up your large project into a bunch of smaller pieces. And you can change it so that it works really well for you and you're getting what you want out of it. And when I'm talking about you, I mean the whole team. So it's a framework, a set of guidelines that helps you to develop code more quickly. We also want to focus much more on the working software. So that thing about like pushing out a little bit of software much more often, rather than having comprehensive documentation. So when I say comprehensive documentation, I'm not even joking right here. I had to write a software detailed design one time, and it was like 100 pages long. If we added up all of my code together, it would probably be 100 pages. And then I had to write in a Word document a whole software detailed design, discussing how different things interact and drawing out diagrams and things like that. So that comprehensive documentation, my users never saw it. All they interacted with was the software, the application that I developed. And so we really want to focus much more on the software rather than the documentation, because that's where the value is. We're not saying documentation is not important, especially in heavily regulated industries like medical and blah, 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 but software is more important. We also want to focus much more on collaboration with our customers and kind of keeping that really tight feedback loop rather than working through a lot of contract negotiations. Like, I'm going to do this and you're going to do that. No, let's just make sure that our customer is engaged in the feedback, and we can continue to collaborate and push things out that they want to see. And then the fourth one is really, I think, probably the most important one, is that we want to be able to respond to change rather than following a plan. So before, when I said it's going to take, maybe your project is going to take 5 years, 6 years to push out, that's a 6-year plan. That is a huge, huge plan. And oftentimes back in the day before Agile development, you would really, really try hard to stick to that plan rather than noticing maybe a year in that this idea isn't even worth it anymore. And so by having these smaller sprints, these smaller little iterations of software development, we're able to change course if we need to after each little sprint, rather than having to wait 6 years before we can get feedback from our customers. So I kind of alluded to a lot of these things on the previous slide, but Agile teams are different from the typical software development teams. So on these teams, we want to be able to self-organize. So we want to be able to do whatever piece of work we want to be able to do. Maybe we want to be able to pick our teams. When I worked at 3M, I worked there for about 10 years. And in my last role where I was there, we did Agile across the entire software lab. And everyone, for the most part, you got to pick which team you actually wanted to be on. And then once you're on that team, you get to pick your team name. And we had so many fun names like Fireball and Cirrus and all of these different names that kind of had to do with the project we were delivering, but it was fun to create those and to come up with a little mascot and things like that. So organizing and doing the work the way that we felt like was the right way to do it, with a lot of independence in how we were going to pull that off. That's one of my favorite things. Also that cross-functional collaboration. I've kind of alluded to this one a whole lot already, but we want to be able to just do what needs to be done to get the work done. Just because you're a DBA doesn't mean you can't test a little bit of code too. So let's all work together hand in hand to just get our software out, the best software we possibly can, as quickly as we possibly can. We also will talk much more about this planning and iteration planning whenever we get to the Scrum Framework here in just a few minutes. But it takes, instead of just one person having the idea and one business analyst writing out those requirements, the team works together to come up with how do we plan and implement this software to meet the goals from our customers. So all of these things are all about, I think, having fun, working well together, and just getting stuff out to our customers. So you'll hear about a lot of different Agile frameworks. Scrum is really the most popular one. I like Kanban, and some people say that Kanban. I'm not quite sure. I say Kanban. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of those couple of frameworks. But there's also Scrum Bon, which is a little bit of Scrum and Kanban. I've actually done this one in a past life as well, and it works just fine too when you're not when there's not as much visibility on your project. If you are just trying to get some stuff done, maybe like an extra project, Scrum Bon is a great one. XP is extreme programming. Also, sometimes you do paired programming within XP. And so you really bring your customer into that product development. A lot of design thinking goes on there. And then APF is one that I've actually not heard of, but this is much more focused on the teamwork itself. So I'm sure if you go out and Google Agile frameworks, you could probably find more information about it and additional frameworks that I don't even have listed here. So Kanban, it's pretty simple. My daughter is in college now and she does Kanban sometimes, but it's essentially like you have a few columns. It's a way to visualize your work and how is it getting done. So you usually have at least 3 projects, to do, work in progress or WIP, and done. You see this picture that I put in here. This was actually a Kanban board that I made during a home remodel project. So I really like to see the progress being done. I love that done pile. When we were done with the whole remodel, it was all the Post-it notes were just falling off over there. And that was so satisfying to me. But it's really satisfying to kind of see the work move across the board and get closer and closer to done. But another reason I wanted to show this is not only because I use Scrum and Kanban pretty much throughout my entire life. I have additional columns here too. So there were things that I got to pick. And so I made those pink. I also did color coding. I have a lot of I love organizing and this sort of thing. So my pink and orange ones were things that I got to pick out. So what counters am I going to have? What mirrors, lights, all these kind of things. And then there was stuff that was kind of more out of my control. So the renovation work. When are the guys going to come over to tear down the garage and rebuild it up? And so each of those blue Post-its were something that was a little bit more out of my control, but I could still see the progress happen. Then you see the in progress column there. I mean, from a Kanban perspective, there's probably too much in progress there. If you limit your work in progress, you can focus more and get more done, generally speaking. But sometimes you get a little bit stuck and have to work on multiple things. And then I have this column called finalizing. So maybe I've picked out the mirror that I want, but I haven't purchased it yet. And so that it's really close to done, but it's not done. So when it's done, purchased in my home, that's when it would go over to the done pile. And this concept of done is something that if you ever do agile development, I'm sure you will hear that. There's a difference between dev done and done. So a developer might tell you something is done, and then your testing person might go in and find an edge case and a new bug that needs to be resolved. So it didn't really get all the way to done. It's not done, it's dev done. You may experience that in the world one day. So then kind of moving here into the Scrum framework. This is a little bit complicated, a little bit to take in all at one time, but we're going to go through it and then we'll come back to the same picture too and review again. But the main thing that you'll learn with the Scrum framework is a concept of 3-5-3. There are 3 roles, which we'll see. There are 5 ceremonies or events, and there are 3 artifacts. And I also mentioned earlier about the sprint. So these sprints, according to the Scrum framework, they're typically 1 to 4 weeks. So instead of 5 years, now we're going to deliver a little bit of software that can be tested in 1 to 4 weeks and get feedback from our users, and then just continue to iterate through that. So let's just go through the slides and then we'll come back and talk about this again. So we have 3 roles on the team. So before we had a lot of different personas with different roles doing specific things like writing the requirements and testing and all of these sorts of things. Well, with Agile, remember that Agile teams are different and the team does the work. So whether I'm a DBA for my specialty or a front-end engineer, there is work that needs to be done and this team is going to get it done. The product owner, that's what I had been before. The product owner really sets the goal and the vision of the product. So they really define what is it going to be and why is this thing actually needed. So the what and the why. And then the team gets to decide how that's actually accomplished. So the product owner talks, we mentioned the what and the why, and then we write all of the what's out in a backlog. They're typically done with user stories. And so it might be, as a product owner, I want a product backlog that is prioritized so that my team knows what to do. So in a user story, we always talk about who it is, what they want, and why they want it. And that helps the team really understand what's happening there so that they can implement it in whichever way they think is the right way to do it. And then, not to be skipped over at all, save the best for last, is that Scrum Master. So the Scrum Master is really the Scrum expert, and they are going to make sure that the Scrum processes are followed. Each team can kind of modify Scrum to work the way that they want it to work for them, but there is a working agreement that is created when a team comes together, and the Scrum Master makes sure that you're following that working agreement. They lead the ceremonies or events as we go through, and they support the team. If the team is not happy with something, the Scrum Master really digs in and tries to find a new way of approaching this process to make it a little bit better for the team. So through all of that, we also have 5 events. So one of the main events is backlog refinement. Usually that's done, at least started with the product owner creating that product backlog. What are all the things, what are all the user stories that we need to accomplish to achieve our goal and vision for this idea? So in backlog refinement, you look through all the user stories and make sure that they make sense to the team who's going to be pulling it off. You start to talk about like how long is it going to take, how difficult it is, and things like that. And then once you have like a really nice backlog that's nicely prioritized and understood, then you'll have sprint planning. So you'll take this long, long backlog of the entire product and you'll say, oh, well, I think we can do these 3 or 7 or however many user stories in this next sprint. Remember, our sprint is 1 to 4 weeks. And at the end of that sprint, we want to have something that is incrementally shippable or something like that. We want to have a piece of working software that can be tested. So that is what happens in our sprint planning. We take our big backlog and pull off a few things that are doable in a single sprint. Each day, the Scrum Master is going to lead the daily Scrum. This is a super short meeting. It's often sometimes called a stand-up because you want to stand up so it doesn't take too long. It should be 15 minutes max. And every day the team comes in and says, what did they do yesterday? So I completed the API layer on this particular method. What am I going to do today? I'm going to connect that API to the button click and any impediments that are kind of keeping me from getting my work done. So what did I do yesterday? What am I doing today? And what is anything that's going to prevent me from doing it? That could be I have a doctor's appointment. That could be I'm waiting on someone else to do something. And then the Scrum Master actions on that. If there are any impediments, it's up to the Scrum Master to go to the other team. A doctor's appointment is probably just fine to keep as it is, and the Scrum Master should stay out of that. But the Scrum Master is kind of in charge of making sure that that team can really do as much work as possible. So at the end of the sprint, now we have a sprint review. And at the sprint review, that's where we get to demo the work that we've done through that whole sprint. So it's really like show and tell. It was always my favorite part. Like we worked so hard for a week or two. Now I want to show you what we did. Let me show you what we did. And we also always try to have the customers or key stakeholders in that sprint review so that they can provide feedback on what you've done. So it's not just rush through and let me show you a thing. That conversation part is really important because we need the feedback to go back into our next sprint so we can make sure that we're still building the right thing. And then finally, there is a sprint retrospective. So in a retrospective, that means we're looking back. And so we look back over the last sprint that we just completed, and we talk about what went well, what didn't go so great, and how can we improve it. And so again, this is led by the Scrum Master, and you just try to identify ways to continuously improve your Scrum process. Maybe we need to change our working agreement ever so slightly. Whatever it is that the team needs to do their work more efficiently, that's what we tried to identify there in the sprint retrospective. It's also a really great time to give props to your friends. Like, oh, I couldn't have completed that story without a little bit of help from Val. And so that's a really great spot to kind of build up more of your team camaraderie and make sure that you're still really working really well together as a team. And so we have 3 artifacts. We've already talked a little bit about these, but we have our product backlog. So that's the whole entire thing. It's initially created by the product owner and prioritized by the product owner, and it's continually improved by the entire team. The product owner does own the prioritization because they have the what and the why in mind, but you really start to work on it all together as a team to really get those user stories well understood. And then in the sprint backlog, we're going to work as a team and we're going to take our big backlog and cut off just a couple of things that we can do together in a single sprint. And then at the end of the sprint, we have an artifact called a potentially shippable product increment. Rolls off the tongue. It's also sometimes called a minimally viable product, an MVP. And that is it's a piece of software or something. It's a piece of your product that can be delivered by the team and reviewed with customers to get that feedback and to put that into our next sprint for what are we going to do. So now that we've gone over all of it, this picture is going to make a little bit more sense, I think. So now we have our product owner who has the idea. We understand the what and the why. We create our big product backlog. And then we work in our sprint planning session to identify our sprint backlog. We have a daily scrum every day. So we have these happening all the time. We have our backlog refinement where we review our big product backlog and get ready for our next sprint. We have our sprint review or demo where we also get feedback from our users. And then our sprint retrospective where we get feedback from our team about how do we do this better. And then at the end of this, we have a piece of software or a piece of our product that can be shipped out into an incremental product release. And so we just continue and continue and continue in this pattern. So that is an introduction to Agile and a little bit of a deep dive into Scrum. And just kind of to wrap things up, I have a couple of references here. The Agile Manifesto, super duper short, pretty much included in one of my slides. And then that video that I linked right there is the Introduction to the Scrum Framework by Scrum Inc. And that's where I took most of this information from. So it's about a 5-minute video, and you can watch that for a quick little overview.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Candace. We do have a couple of questions if you're cool with that.
Yeah.
Wondering, so at Code Savvy, we are using Jira and kind of teaching that tool to people, but what other tools have you used or do you use for your project management in this way?
Yeah, so Jira is a super common one. I see a lot of people using that one. I've also used something called Azure DevOps. And so that it looks a lot like Jira, but you have different levels of stories and can use that. Also just plain old Post-it notes. You saw me use that. You can just put Post-it notes on a wall and that works really well. So
doesn't even have to be techie.
Exactly.
All right. One other one was wondering how like UX personas or like your user assumptions are built into the agile process.
Yes.
And are they ever like checked back on as you're getting that feedback from the actual users?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's really great to incorporate design through the entire software development process. I'm a huge believer in design thinking, having designers on your team. If your people can't figure out how to use the software, then there's a problem. It's not the people, it's probably the people designing the software.
Right.
So let's have a designer on the team. Let's do some user persona, what's it called? User journey mapping. Isn't that what? Yes.
Yep.
Let's do that at the beginning so that we can understand our whole process. And we need our users in the room. We need our users in the room to see the demo. We need our designers, the people that are really focused on that piece, on our team to hear the feedback from our users and to help us, the team, to continue to make it better. So please, let's have designers all through the whole thing. Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much, Candace. And we really appreciate you sharing all your knowledge and insight with us. And we'll see you soon.
All right. Sounds great. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.